One sentence was enough to turn Piraeus from a commercial success story into a geopolitical battlefield. When U.S. Ambassador Kimberly Guilfoyle publicly challenged the reality of Chinese control over Greece's most strategic port, she didn't speak like a diplomat protecting stable relations. She spoke like someone drawing a red line, suggesting there are ways around COSCO's grip, even hinting that Piraeus could be treated as something that can change hands. And Beijing didn't ignore it. The Chinese embassy answered fast, unusually sharp, and crystal clear. The port is not for sale. That exchange matters because it tells you the truth most people miss. This isn't an argument about investments. It's a fight over leverage, over who can shape trade, data, and military logistics in the Eastern Mediterranean. But then the story got darker, because a few months later, in February 2026, Greek authorities arrested a senior Hellenic Air Force colonel linked to military telecommunications training and secure communication systems, accused of passing classified information to Chinese intelligence through encrypted channels. The strategic message is already loud. China's footprint in Greece isn't only ports and money, it's also access. So Washington shifts tactics, not with slogans, with architecture, ports, shipyards, LNG terminals, fiber routes, base agreements. A slow, methodical plan to make China's flagship investment in Greece strategically lonely. By the end of this video, you'll see the real American strategy. It's not kick China out of Greece, it's something smarter. Redesign Greece so that China cannot turn one port into leverage over an entire NATO ally. To understand why one colonel in cavalry rattled Washington, you have to start at the waterline of Piraeus. Back in 2009, Greece handed COSCO the operation of 2 major container terminals. Then, the debt crisis hit like an earthquake. The country was drowning in austerity. Unemployment exploded. Western investors didn't line up to modernize Greek infrastructure. Many were waiting to see if Greece would even stay in the euro. And that's when China moved, with the patience of a state that thinks in decades, not election cycles. In 2016, COSCO bought a controlling stake in the Piraeus Port Authority, eventually rising to 67%. For Athens, it was survival. For Beijing, it was a trophy, a Belt and Road gateway sitting inside the European Union. And to be fair, the commercial story is real. COSCO invested heavily. Throughput climbed. Piraeus shot up in European port rankings. China can credibly argue, we invested when others wouldn't. But Washington never looked at Piraeus like a simple port. It looked at it like a platform. Because modern ports are not just steel, water, and cranes. They're software. Every container is scanned, logged, routed, priced. Every vessel's schedule becomes a digital signature. Port systems connect shipping lines, customs, trucking, storage, and security. That data, who ships what, when, and where, can be as valuable as the cargo itself. And this is where Chinese state ownership changes the risk calculation. China's national intelligence framework includes legal obligations that can require organizations and citizens to support state intelligence work. That fact alone does not prove COSCO is an intelligence arm, but it does explain why Western security services treat Chinese state-owned infrastructure differently from a normal private investor, especially when that infrastructure sits inside a NATO ally. Now, add geography. Piraeus is not somewhere in Greece. It sits in the same maritime ecosystem as key Greek naval facilities and within the broader strategic orbit of US and NATO activity in the region. It's also a natural funnel for trade flows that feed the Balkans and Central Europe. In other words, Piraeus is a hinge. For a decade, Athens tried to keep all of this inside the economics box. Greece needed capital. China provided it. End of story. But the Kavouri case cracked that box open, because once an officer connected to military communications is accused of feeding Beijing, the question becomes brutally simple. If China is willing to hunt for access inside Greek networks, why wouldn't it also try to exploit access around Greek infrastructure? This is the moment Piraeus stops being a commercial success story and becomes what I call the dragon's head, the visible part of a much larger strategic animal. And then Washington stopped speaking in hints. In November 2025, the new U.S. ambassador in Athens, Kimberly Guilfoyle, publicly signaled what American strategists had been saying privately for years, that Greece shouldn't be locked into a future where one of its most strategic assets is effectively controlled by a Chinese state giant. Her wording was intentionally provocative. She suggested there are ways around it, and even floated the idea that Piraeus could be for sale. Beijing answered immediately and unusually harshly. The Chinese embassy in Greece issued a rare public rebuke, calling the remarks groundless attacks and malicious slander, accusing Washington of a Cold War mentality and insisting the port is not for sale, warning against outside interference in Greece's internal affairs. That exchange matters because it confirms something bigger than diplomacy. Greece is no longer just hosting investments, it is hosting a confrontation. And once the conflict becomes public, Washington's next move becomes predictable. It doesn't need to seize Piraeus, it just needs to build Greece a parallel system so powerful that Piraeus stops being irreplaceable. A short drive from Athens, Elefsina used to look like the opposite of Piraeus. Not a success story, a graveyard, idle cranes, rusted steel, unpaid workers, a shipyard that symbolized Greece's industrial decline. But for Washington, that decline was an opening, because Elefsina sits in the same wider maritime ecosystem as Piraeus, but without Chinese ownership baked into the DNA. So the U.S. didn't revive Elefsina the normal way. It used financial power as geopolitical engineering. In late 2023, the U.S. Development Finance Corporation committed major financing, $125 million, to support the modernization and revival of the Elefsina shipyard under ONEX. And what matters is not just the money, it's the message. This isn't only an industrial project, it's a strategic one. This is what a secret war looks like in real life. Not CIA raids, balance sheets, because a modern shipyard is leverage. It means allied naval vessels and commercial fleets can repair, refit, and stay operational inside a trusted environment. It means LNG carriers, ships feeding Europe after the shock of the Ukraine war, can be serviced without relying on facilities exposed to strategic rivals. It means an entire ecosystem grows around Western standards, security protocols, specialized labor, spare parts, compliance culture. And Elefsina is only one piece. Up north, Alexandroupoli has become a NATO logistics node, valuable because equipment can move from the port into Eastern Europe through land routes, reducing reliance on the Turkish-controlled straits during sensitive moments. It's not that the straits are closed, it's that in crisis planning, you don't build your strategy around a single choke point. And when you place Elefsina and Alexandroupoli on the same mental map, the pattern becomes obvious. The United States is building redundancy. Alexandroupoli becomes a clean military door. Elefsina becomes a clean industrial door. Suda Bay remains the deep water anchor. And around these nodes, Washington signals interest in a broader network of Greek infrastructure, not necessarily to buy everything, but to ensure Greece has multiple strategic options that don't pass through a single Chinese-controlled gateway. China understands this perfectly. That's why whenever counterbalancing Piraeus comes up, the response is firm. The port is not for sale. But the U.S. doesn't need it to be for sale. It needs it to be less central. And here's the part most people miss. Once an alternative network exists, Greek politics change. If Piraeus is the only serious node, Athens has limited freedom. The port becomes too big to touch. But if Elefsina and other hubs rise, the Chinese stake becomes less indispensable and therefore less protected by Greek caution. This is how influence is rolled back in the 21st century. You don't storm the fortress, you build a better city next door. When shipyards wake up, defense order books wake up too, and markets usually react before governments admit what's changing. That's why right now I'm watching an ETF that's up about approximately 57.8% over the last 12 months. I'll reveal which one in a moment. Today's video is sponsored by Freedom24. I use it because it keeps the investing side simple, clear fees, a clean interface, and I can get support in my own language, because leaving cash idle is still a choice. And with inflation eating away at purchasing power, it's rarely the smartest one. So instead of trying to pick the one perfect stock in a world that's getting more unstable by the month, I prefer ETFs, a switchboard approach that spreads exposure across a whole theme. The one I'm watching closely is the iShares Global Aerospace and Defense, the UCITS version, ticker DFND, built around the companies behind the hardware and supply chains we keep talking about, with names like Boeing, RTX, GE Aerospace, Airbus, and Rolls-Royce. Of course, investing involves risk. Past performance isn't a guarantee, and your capital is at risk. Sign up takes about 15 minutes if you want to explore it. Check the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen. And Freedom24 has welcome promo codes available until April 30th, 2026, where you can get up to 10 gift stocks worth up to $800 each, depending on the code you activate. If you join through our link, you directly support Money Trail and help us keep producing independent geopolitical analysis. There's a paradox at the heart of the West's newest trade dream. The US and Europe promote alternative corridors to rival China's Belt and Road, networks that are supposed to be trusted, resilient, and strategically aligned. But for years, Greek planners could quietly point to a brutal reality. The most efficient European entry point for many new corridors is Piraeus. That contradiction is now exploding because the corridor war is no longer theory. China's Belt and Road was never just infrastructure. It was a design philosophy. Control key nodes, then let the flows follow. Ports, rail, logistics parks, financing. Once you own the nodes, you don't need to own the whole map. You can still shape it. IMEC, the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, is the Western answer in progress. The concept is simple. Connect India to the Gulf, move across the Arabian Peninsula, reach the Eastern Mediterranean, and then link onward to Europe. Greece appears in many discussions as a potential European gateway, but here's the problem. If your anti-Belt and Road corridor ends at a port that is 67% owned by a Chinese state company, you're not building independence. You're building a supply chain that ends at Beijing's European checkpoint. That's why serious analysts have argued that Piraeus, precisely because of COSCO ownership, can become a vulnerability for Western corridor thinking, and that Europe should consider alternative nodes so that the corridor's endpoint does not sit under Chinese leverage. And timing matters. IMEC is still developing, and regional instability has slowed momentum, but even stalled projects shape strategy because they force governments to decide what they're willing to trust for the next 20 years. So Greece becomes more than a chessboard, it becomes the answer key. Because if the West doesn't want its future corridor to end at a Chinese gate, it needs other doors: Thessaloniki, Alexandroupoli, upgraded rail lines, logistics parks, secondary ports, redundancy across the map, and suddenly, Greek geography turns into a marketplace of options. Every upgraded rail line north isn't just development, it's a bypass. Every investment in a non-Chinese port isn't just growth, it's a geopolitical vote. Greece tried to sit between Washington and Beijing, but corridors don't tolerate neutrality. They force alignment, because whoever controls the endpoint controls the leverage. And that brings us to the final layer. Ports and corridors are hardware. The real war is over the switches. By the way, only 13.4% of you watching have subscribed. If you appreciate deep dive geopolitical analyses, hit like and subscribe. It helps us make more videos like this. If you want to see America's strategy clearly, don't listen to speeches. Look at the three fronts where Washington is rewriting Greece's strategic environment: military, digital, and energy. Front 1 is military. Alexandroupoli has become a crucial NATO logistics hub precisely because it provides an alternative route into the Balkans and Eastern Europe, and the security focus is no longer theoretical. In 2025, Greek authorities also dealt with a high-profile espionage-related case tied to monitoring sensitive movements around Alexandroupoli. Another reminder that ports are now intelligence targets, not just economic assets. Front 2 is digital, and this is where the Kavouri case really matters because communication systems are the nervous system of modern power. In 2020, the United States publicly welcomed Greece into the Clean Network Direction, an effort focused on reducing exposure to high-risk vendors in critical digital infrastructure. Joining a framework doesn't magically eliminate risk, but it signals orientation. It tells operators, ministries, and investors core systems should align with Western security standards, and that logic hits ports directly. Because the modern port is software, whoever touches the networks touches the port. So by pushing Greece to treat telecoms and digital infrastructure as critical, Washington reduces the attack surface around strategic assets, including the Chinese-owned ones. Front 3 is energy, the most physical form of strategy. Greece has become a serious LNG gateway. The floating LNG terminal off Alexandroupoli has a capacity designed to push gas into the regional system. Revitusa near Athens remains the key onshore LNG backbone. Together, these facilities make Greece more than a consumer. They make Greece a corridor. Gas arrives by ship. It enters the Greek grid. Then it can move north, feeding neighbors, stabilizing markets, and anchoring Greece inside Europe's post-Russian energy architecture. Now, connect the three fronts. Military routes protect the territory. Digital standards protect the data. Energy infrastructure protects the economy. Once you build all three, you don't need to take back Piraeus to neutralize it. You can surround it. China still owns cranes and docks, but America is building the systems that decide what matters around those cranes, where NATO moves, where data flows, where energy enters, and which ports become essential. So the secret war is not a single confrontation. It's a slow-motion containment strategy designed to make Beijing's flagship investment in Greece strategically isolated over time. In the end, geography is destiny, but alliances are a choice. For years, Greece tried to be a bridge, American security on one side, Chinese money on the other. But the espionage allegation in Kavouri showed the hidden cost of that balancing act. When the competition is about access, every commercial asset becomes a security question. So Greece is being rewired, not by tearing up contracts overnight, but by building redundancy. Alternative ports, allied shipyards, hardened digital standards, and energy corridors that bind Athens tighter to the west. Piraeus may still be COSCO's European trophy, but it is now sitting inside a NATO lake, surrounded by Western infrastructure that limits its leverage. And that is the real verdict of this moment. Greece is no longer an open gateway where everyone can plug in. It is becoming the West's gatekeeper and a front line of America's invisible war with China. Special thanks to Freedom 24 for making this analysis possible. If you're serious about building a great financial future, be sure to check them out in the description below. And if this video helped you see what's really happening behind the headlines, Watch the videos on your screen right now. They continue this story from Greece's ports and corridors to what comes next. As the US-China rivalry tightens its grip on the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean,